My grandfather was a house builder, not by profession, but by avocation. He built 4 houses that I know about. There was a cabin in Elko, Nevada, when he worked for the railroad early in the last century. Then in Salt Lake City, when he and my grandmother were first married, he built them a small bungalow by the Jordan River. When they moved back to Keokuk, Iowa, he built the house on 14th Street. And then there was the dream house, a rambling, gabled, 6-year labor of love on the bluff above the river 8 miles north of town. When I went to live with them, they still lived in that house in Keokuk. It was built in what had been my great-grandmother's backyard. She'd owned the corner property at Concert and 14th Streets, a large, square Victorian that faced Concert Street, but around the corner, tucked up against the overgrown alley at the back of the lot, was the same narrow frame house that my mother had grown up in. When I was 8, my mother became ill with a mysterious vascular condition that would darken her nature and shorten her life. She needed quiet, everybody said, and I was sent from New Jersey to live with my grandparents in that tiny town on the Mississippi River where I'd been born as an accident of the Second Great War. That's when I started walking. You know what I mean. There was to be none of that chauffeuring around which suburban kids a decade later took for granted. No, my grandfather believed passionately in that 19th century vision of clean living and self-reliance. Walking, he believed, invigorated not only the body, but the character as well. So I walked everywhere in that old town, ankle deep in mists from the river, shrouded in a fog of history. Mule drivers, Irish stevedores, and channel callers like Mark Twain, who had lived in a town just to the south. There were the ghosts of gamblers and catfish gals and tight-lipped daughters of the American Revolution, like my grandmother, foursquare in their determined and joyless claim to pedigree. On their westward odyssey, the Mormons had crossed the ice-covered Mississippi River from Nauvoo, Illinois, my grandmother's own forebears among them, just a few miles from that piece of land that my grandfather owned on the bluffs north of town. He could remember the river before the lock and dam, when there had been a factory close by the shallows that made pearl buttons out of the clamshells that barefoot ragamuffins harvested along the banks. He felt a part of the history of the place, pored over the journals, and based on his studies and the fact that the dam had changed the river, my grandfather always insisted that the Historical Society's calculations were incorrect and that the French explorer Marquette had actually set foot first upon his land. Well, there was an ongoing feud, an exchange of angry letters, and the placement of an historical marker elsewhere. Nevertheless, my grandfather called this place Marquette Point. 25 years later, when the winters had got too cold and they felt themselves too old to keep up the place that they had built with their own hands, they sold it and went to live where it was warm. But during the year and a half that I lived with them, they were still in town and going out to the point every spare moment to work on that house. On the Saturdays that my grandparents had poker club at their house, they would give me $1.50 for a hamburger dinner basket and Coke at Tippin' Buds on Main Street, the price of admission to the only movie theater in town, and a pillow. I was to stay until the movie stopped showing. Those were the days when they showed movies continuously, and nobody said anything to you if you wanted to stay and see it again. And I can still remember being alone in the first row of the balcony with my pillow on the rail and being tapped on the shoulder by the usher to tell me that the show was over. Then, carrying my pillow, I would walk all the way home through the sleeping brick alleys of that little river town that would never again be the major stopping off place that it had been in the old days when there were rapids there. I was alone with my thoughts in those narrow, uneven alleyways, cobbled 100 years ago, shaded with trees and shadowed with phantasms. My imagination was floating free, and the mermaids swam close to the surface. I learned to love walking then, though it was many years before I understood that. I loved it without knowing, and a habit was born. In fact, I had just come in from walking through the bustling Kensington Market in Toronto when the call came that my mother was dying. I was told that she would probably not last the night, that I must come at once. The last several years of her life had been difficult. She had not been graceful in dealing with the relentless ill health, which was the final insult in an unfortunate life. She had embarked upon an impulsive and lunatic scheme to remodel an enormous old Victorian house into rental rooms. My grandfather built his house, and my mother tore the insides out of hers. What was left of her health collapsed. She did not die that night. Well, I sat by her bed waiting for the stertorous breathing, which the pert young nurse had warned me would signal the end. My mother did not die that night, nor for 3 days and 2 more nights afterwards. She died by inches, literally becoming colder to the touch, 1 degree at a time. The nurse had told me that even though my mother was in a coma, she could hear me, as the hearing was the last sense to go. Her eyes were half open, they were unfocused, but I could see that they moved whenever I spoke. They tracked back and forth as though she were looking for me in some distant place. It's said that people are born and die at the moments when the 2 worlds are closest together, dawn and dusk. And it was at dusk on the 3rd day that there was thunder over the mountains and a light rain was falling. And Sister Charles Margaret came sweeping into the room at the exact moment of my mother's passing to close her eyes and tell us that she was gone. My grandparents took my mother's death particularly hard. It aged them visibly. And not long afterwards, they abandoned the house that they had built together on 30 acres of bluff overlooking the mighty river. They moved to Arizona, and for the first time in what would be 70 years of marriage, they lived in a house that my grandfather had not built. Now I cannot imagine what it was that kept me so busy, but something always came up and I saw them rarely in the last decade of their long lives. My grandmother died first, and my grandfather, that indomitable man who had built every house he lived in but the last, failed rapidly after her death. When he started a fire one morning cooking his breakfast, it was determined that he should go to Dubuque to live with my mother's sister Barbara. I was in New York at the time, and I planned to visit during the summer. I was to come as soon as I finished directing a ridiculous production of 7 Brides for 7 Brothers on the 10 by 14 stage in the Round. It was at a theater in the Berkshires which called itself, improbably, New York's foremost musical summer stock theater. I remembered it was the 4th of July and extremely hot when I took an afternoon nap before rehearsal. It was too hot to sleep, and I dreamt of drowning. It was dusk when I struggled to the surface, certain that I had heard someone call my name. I walked to the third theater early and sat there alone, waiting for actors and crew to arrive. The next morning, my wife called to tell me that my grandfather had died that afternoon, at the very moment that I started awake from that troubled sleep. He had gone before I got back to say goodbye, to thank him for the habit of walking. When I finally dragged myself out of my childhood, that wild-eyed creature was unable to give love or receive it. So it was many years after the fact that I came to understand that my grandparents cared genuinely and deeply for me. Those good people who took in a troubled, cast-off child without question were the ones who cared for me after all, my hapless mother being distracted and finally consumed by her own despair. But there's more to my grandfather's legacy. He gave me the example of independence of thought. Here is a man of humble origins, entirely self-educated, who bellowed "The Road to Mandalay" every morning and knew Kipling's "If" by heart. You know the one I mean. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you but make allowance for their doubting too. Here was a man who pondered important questions and came to conclusions on his own without the benefit of a liberal education or the support of a community of like-minded people. In a time and place of small-mindedness, my grandfather's free-thinking convictions were won at a considerable cost. When in my teens, I took to radical thinking as easily as letting my hair grow long, I never realized it was because he had paved the way for me. At 8 years old, I resented being an unwilling conscript in the labor of building that big house. At 16, as we traveled by car through the parks and canyons of the Mountain West, and stood like soldiers every morning to watch him pack the trunk, just so, I saw only a martinet whose thinking, like Emerson's, was fixed in the last century. I couldn't see the connection between us. I missed the continuity, and I didn't appreciate a man who could build a